Hello and welcome to the Academy Podcast.
Hello, everyone. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go on. Who are we?
I'm afraid to talk now because you're just gonna. My name is Jeremy Hiss.
And my name is Austin Parenti.
Woo! And we are back.
We are back.
Yes. So things got a little busy. Quick update.
I had a child. No, I'm kidding. That didn't happen. But that would be a good excuse.
Yeah. So the real excuse would be that, unfortunately, my grandfather passed away 3 weeks ago. And so I've just kind of been struggling with that. And then I had a change of career. So I am now working in education, just like Austin, except I'm working in higher education. So
I'm in lower education.
in primary schooling.
Yes, but we are, I speak on behalf of our viewers and our friends, of course. We are sorry to hear about your grandfather, but we're also super excited for you with this new career opportunity that's, you're going to do wonderful things. And I'm very excited to see where this all leads.
Yeah, absolutely. And as also a quick heads up, I will be leaving for Air Force basic training a few months from now. So plenty of content to put out. So just be on the lookout for that. That there may be a lapse in the recordings coming up. So on to the book.
It's just so good to be back. You know. And so we're here, coming up on the end of the Republic here. We're in this section that, I was actually wondering, I was like, I remember talking about the different types of governments in the Republic, hence, kind of the name. And I was like, oh, man, maybe that was a different book. But here we are. We actually did arrive at that part, and I was pleasantly surprised. So Plato's plan here, in response to a question, he is going to diagnose 4 other types of governments, different types of societies outside of the one that he's already described, his utopia. Right. He's going to describe those 4, and he's going to show kind of their weaknesses and their fault lines, and by doing that, by showing the negative, it is supposed to strengthen his argument for the positive, for his society. And inevitably, this section will wrap up and bring us back to the question of justice, which I feel like there were so many tangents that we've departed from that in a way. Of course, everything's building back to it, but he will finally go back and say, and so, as was initially questioned, here is our response to that first question about is it truly beneficial to behave in a just way or an unjust way? Is that fair?
Yeah, essentially. I would only point out that it was kind of like there are different tangents, as you put it. There's different trails that they kind of went on that didn't seem to necessarily relate. But as you said, in building up that utopian society, Plato was introducing his virtue ethics and demonstrating that justice is something to be pursued in and of itself, not necessarily in a deontological sense where like there's rules that you need to follow because they are rules, and not in a consequentialist bit where we follow justice because it produces good outcomes, but rather he was trying to demonstrate actually. He kind of sidesteps Thrasymachus' question in the beginning, right? Because the conversation is, well, does it pay more to be unjust, essentially, right? So then he wanted to, he took a step back, and then in engaging in dialectic, he said, we have to define what is justice. And so essentially this whole, like everything from book 2 to now has been defining the very conception of justice in Plato's mind, which has been inner psychic harmony, right, of the soul, right?
Yes.
So and so he did that through demonstrating, blowing it up to the city scale, and then coming back down to the individual. And so that's kind of the surmising of what has occurred. Obviously, there's stuff about the forms and the cave and all that gets thrown into there. All that is important, but that is like the one sentence like summary, right? So now we have to return to the original question because now we're at the very end of the book. Only thing after this is theory of art. Which I guess you would be excited about because you're an artist.
Yeah,
and
I like painting.
And then we have the myth of which is like, or air or whatever, er. And so that is weird, more metaphysical, religious kind of stuff. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. But here he's going back to the original question of, does justice pay more? Is justice, beneficial essentially over injustice? And so that's why he's now engaging in this section, because we've now defined what justice is, and now we have to go back and actually answer the question. So this is supposed to be like the big wrap up, right? And we'll get into it, but it's
excellent.
Yeah.
So a few things that we're going to want to look for. I don't know that we want to spend our full time together just going over those 4 different governments. I'm not sure that would be as beneficial as spending more time on the conclusion itself.
Yes. Wow.
Right.
Because this is why I love you. It's brilliant.
Drop it.
Yeah. I mean, if you want, I could just hit a really quick.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of just bounce off me.
Sure.
Maybe.
So first kind of question is like the first. I think it is important to mention this. We must consider the time and place in which Plato lived.
Right.
So when he's
Always.
describing these governments, we can't think of it as we would think of it. So when I was reading, particularly the democracy section,
right.
He's living in an Athenian democracy. But you had also said that even the democracy he's describing there isn't super accurate. So
right.
can you give us the survey of these types of governments, and then I guess the historical relevance or what they looked like in his time versus ours? I feel like it's hard to understand something like democracy when our only lens for it is 21st century democracy,
Right, which is completely unlike what the Athenians would have been experiencing. Okay, so really quick. So for those of you who don't know, in this section, Plato's continuing with the city-soul parallel, right? So that's the theme that Austin and I have been kind of running with as we've been talking about this, is that you have the city, and the construction of the city is supposed to match up with the construction of the individual soul. So as to say that, you have your 3 parts of the city, which then have their corresponding 3 parts in the soul. You have, the guardians, which are at the head, which are reason, the philosopher kings, the middle part, which are obviously the military guardians. And so they embody spirit, courage, valor, honor.
Thumos.
The thumoides. And so you have your logos, the thumoides, and then you have the demotike, which is the lower bronze class, which are the various pleasures. And things are well ordered and put in their right place, then the city correspondingly will also be harmonious in pursuing that, which is the common good, essentially, and have a cohesive social fabric. So so we enter in a problem right away, because he wants to continue in that city-soul parallel, but however, Plato doesn't make it clear that how do we devolve from the utopian republic that he has established and then into the other forms of government, because what he's essentially trying to do is that Plato is going to establish a form of governance that once again corresponds with a particular part of the soul, but he's supposing that this government or this state is not harmonious, right? So he's basically saying, okay, well, let's imagine that the spirited part rules in the society and it is not reason that rules, right? And then so this is the society that we're going to get. And so what he'll do is that he'll say, here is the government, and this is what the government looks like, this is what the state is going to look like, and then he says, and this is what the character of the individual in that state is going to look like.
More deductive, going top down.
Right, exactly. However, that doesn't really make any sense because right off the bat, right, we don't know how things devolve. He never establishes that. Secondly, he never, we're individuals, right? So he never has to deal with the question of, and this is something that Juliana says that I really like, that she says that he never has to deal with the question of a just man living in an unjust society, right?
Yes.
Because we only know the just man in the context of his perfect republic in that establishment. But imagine in 21st century America, we don't get to, in any of these societies, how would the individual just man operate? He only establishes this dichotomy of city soul parallel, where you have the unjust society and then the unjust man. And so that corresponds with that particular state. And so that ends up becoming an issue, but I'll explain that away a little bit later, but we'll just get into it now. So those are the 2 problems that we're entering right away. And so,
well, first, when you talk about how it would devolve, he does mention in between each from going from an oligarchy to a democracy, he kind of gives you like this metaphorical family unit.
Right, the father.
So I thought that was pretty.
Son.
I mean, I'm a story guy, so like I thought that was pretty effective. Like, yeah, I could see how one extreme would make the next generation swing to the other. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. It's nice because once again we're going to that emphasis on education, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, okay, you're not raising your son in the right manner to grow up after his father. What I mean is that initial break. Going into the first imperfect society. How does that even occur? He's just like, it just happens,
Well, he said something about like when there's like wrong interbreeding because you can't get the timing right.
Right. He's because if you have it where somebody who is actually belonging in the bronze class going into the gold, that's where
that's
somebody's
the inciting
unworthy.
Action. But again, how do
happens, you exactly? It doesn't. It just goes on
chance,
and on. Yeah,
I guess, or
pretty much because we don't. What we don't know. The real question here is that. Is the Republic something achievable? Because Plato kind of is fuzzy on that, right? Because he says something where, well, it exists beyond us, right? He has that kind of line where he's like, well, it exists out there, perhaps.
It is laid up as a pattern in heaven at the very end.
Which is really beautiful because we'll get into that. Like, go ahead and ask me that question at the end of this episode.
Fine.
And so that would be really cool. But it's very unclear. So the first state that we get into is the Timocratic state, or Timarchy.
Based on Sparta.
Right. It's not, there's no modern state that we would that we would have. I guess there was one African country that kind of was like, it was a mainly white population in Africa that kind of, I don't know, it would kind of be along those lines. I forget what the name of it is, but
is this Thumos led, could we say?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's led by the spirit. It's the warrior state of Sparta, essentially. That's the most apt comparison that we have of it. And so just really quick, essentially, you'll have it where the desire of private property, personal wealth, personal ambition start to creep in, right? Mm-hmm. And so, however, he claims that it is pursued in private, and then in public it is all about honor and valor. And so what you find is that they're not necessarily they still hold to the principles of the old utopian republic state. They still pay lip service to that in public, because they're going after just the statements of their fathers. However, the problem is that they don't have the intellect and the I guess you could say the inner means to pursue those ends. And so what ends up happening is that they instead make it all about military prowess and honor in battle, as being the public virtues to be pursued, right? And then which determines your worth or your goodwill. And so, however, privately you'll be pursuing your own wealth, and that's actually what kind of killed Sparta. So like when Sparta, after Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesus War, what ended up happening was that it had grown to such a greater stature in Greece, and then what ended up happening is that the actual Spartan class, which did not allow for they didn't even allow them to wear any sort of jewelry. There was no makeup. You could not own anything of a material status. That started to creep into the society, and then eventually Sparta became weakened by that. It did not hold the same military cohesiveness after the introduction of that.
Right, because a society like this could really only function as long as they're united and they have less of an idea of the self and more of the collective.
Right,
which is exactly what he built. Plato built his perfect society to be one where you put the needs of the state before the needs of yourself, almost.
I wouldn't say the state. I'm really particular about the terms because political philosophy.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be the state. It's your countrymen. Like he would say that, you remember he was said that, it's like a hand, to the body. It's like the entire body rushes to that part. And so it's like he would say that real virtue of inner virtue, it creates an upwelling and an outpouring of yourself to those around you, to the point that as you engage in whatever your particular skill or craft may be, like however, as you perfect yourself in that end, you're always very cognizant and conscious of the fact that you have a responsibility and a duty, not to state because that's some sort of government, but rather to your brothers and your sisters,
like
your community, your immediate community.
Got
and
it.
so it's all about
Right.
pursuing that common good, right? This conception of the common good, which we'll visit again, and I think in other pieces of literature. And so, correspondingly, really quick, the Timarchic character, obviously, I kind of said it. It's the public pursuit of honor. And I wrote, this public pursuit of honor gives justification for the private pursuit of wealth and office. The Timarchic character fails to pursue any notion of the common good since his ideals are inadequate, and eventually devolves into the pursuit of money. And so he's called to those higher pursuits of reason by the father. However, he doesn't. He's just more fond of military exercise, and prowess.
It's almost like simpler.
Yeah,
he
it's
hasn't
simpler.
been educated to
Because we would say that. If you're not somebody of like great, of great virtue, I guess, of like if we imagine the philosopher who's very humble, who's very wise and kind and giving of himself, and we would say that's like ultimately good. We go, oh, okay, that's a great man, right? But then we wouldn't say the military man who's very proud of his nation and fights well and fights honorably and like holds to those. We would say that is a kind of virtue, right? It is not obviously the ultimate kind, but we would still say he is better than the miser, right? Or like some corporate man who's just in the pursuit of money. So he's somewhere in between, right? A little off the mark.
Gotcha. And then that one would degrade into oligarchy once that temptation for money increases.
Right.
And so help me understand, do we have a modern parallel for oligarchy?
The United States.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to sound stupid, but as I was reading that, I'm like, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's hard. There's no real one-to-one comparison. I would say that you can say, I guess post-Soviet Russia, 1991, 1992, with what they called electroshock therapy for the Russian economy. That when they blew off the lid and just made it open free market, they just created this massive gap between the two.
Well, yeah, and so maybe that's the difference between America and a perfect oligarchy is like we have a middle class. When he was describing the oligarchy, it sounded way more like there's rich and there's poor.
Right. And I mean, of course, people today would claim that like there's a disappearing middle class, and then that's an ongoing debate that I don't really want to enter into it. But but I mean, statistically speaking, and just by data, just pure data, that doesn't really pan out. The way I see it is that there's still a middle class. Now, whether it's disappearing is a different discussion, but there's still a middle class.
Okay.
And then there's gradations of wealth that exist in the United States. But however, when you read this section, you can kind of be like, well, there are kind of some similarities. And I think there's definitely some truth to that, especially when we get into the oligarchic character.
Yeah.
I think that's where the similarities start to come into play.
So the prime thing with the oligarchy is simply put, their primary value is money.
The love of
so
money.
We've gone from value of the common good to value of like ambition and spirit and courage to the value of money.
Right.
And so I think most people don't need to see an argument there. It makes sense. That is a degradation. We can commonly agree that money as your primary value is worse than both the preceding two. Right.
So then when you get into oligarchy, what ends up happening is that you have this widening gap between the rich and the poor. As he talks about giving out loans, and then you keep people in debt, and you
that
keep
was
them
weird.
oppressed. And then but remember that when we're talking about public virtues and what you value as a society, that determines who decides to rule in that society. And that's really poignant as a political point, because then that makes us reflect, what kind of values do I engender as an individual or in my community? What kind of values do I see in my life? And then how does that affect who I put in positions of power and authority? And I think once you look at it that way, you start to get a little self-conscious, right?
Yes.
But I'll let that lie. So what ends up happening is that public virtue of wealth becomes what is known as goodness, right? And so therefore, who is good in quotations is now in power, because we always want the best of us to be in power. Well, the best of us being the rich, and the rich are now in power.
Right.
And so it narrows for Plato, it narrows out exactly who is going to be placed in those positions.
That was the part too that I was like, oh, because he mentions those people in power would want to secure their power and their money, and so they would start to create laws like you must be a landowner in order to like participate in politics. And I was like, oh, wasn't that part of our history at one point too?
Yes, it is.
And then didn't that get dethroned? And how fitting that the next section is democracy.
Right.
And so his transition there was that widening gap between the rich and the poor would eventually lead to just a clean,
revolution,
bloody revolution.
Yeah,
right?
pretty much. Yep, exactly.
And we've seen that many times. Attempted, failed, and attempted, succeeded.
Right.
But then his criticism of democracy, this is where I think we need to take a pause for a second.
Sure.
I think we all understand what our democracy looks like today. What did it look like back then, and how is that different from what he is particularly depicting? Or is he perfectly depicting Athenian democracy?
Not at all. Not even close.
Okay. Yes. So
we all know that Plato was very critical of democracy, particularly of Athens.
Because Socrates died by democracy.
Yeah, sure. And so you end up going from this character of, so we'll talk about just the politics of this. So we have a disunified soul in the oligarchy. It's the pursuit of money above all things. People are upset, angry. You have inefficiencies that come in because there's no longer a specialization in the economic order. You're not pursuing a particular craft or end to yourself. It's just the pursuit of wealth. So all that is broken down. And so now he blows off the lid, right? So it's complete liberty. Everybody's pursuing their own ends. And so it's the greatest degree of diversity, right? So that's kind of where the criticism comes into him for him, where he says, that greatness of diversity and everybody pursuing their own end. He's like, that's fine if you want to get by, right? As a society of just many different individuals. But however, in order to have this notion of the common good, everybody has to pursue like a common end. However, in a democracy, you can't do that because everybody's just complete license, complete liberty.
Yeah, because the value is freedom itself,
right?
Which is going to send you in totally different directions from your neighbor.
Correct. Rather than having that freedom be subservient to some higher order of things. Mm-hmm. So to talk about historical accuracies, however, so in Athens, it wasn't complete license at all. So there were, you had to be a citizen to actually vote. In order to be a citizen, your parents had to be citizens, and you had to be born into a citizen family. So it was hereditary. There were other cases in where you could gain citizenship. However, that had to be granted to you. Not everybody could vote because it took a while for you to travel into Athens in order to participate in the vote. The voting was wild. It was rambunctious. People were shouting, stomping their feet, throwing things. There was, and I mean, we're not talking about a society like ours, where like I think in the United States we do have complete license to basically, our thing is live and let live. Like, do whatever you want in the privacy of your home, just don't bring it into mine, right? That's kind of our motto here, at least in modern day America. However, in Athens, women were not allowed to be going outside and engaging in conversation in the marketplace. People would be run out for all their various beliefs. I mean, Socrates was killed, right, just for teaching. Like, they did not allow just those variances of opinion. So it's not like it wasn't a society of complete license and liberty and people pursuing their own end. We would see Athens as, only men could vote as well. Like I said, it was a pretty rigorous, they had a conception of what of certain cultural norms that they wanted to continue to enforce. That it wouldn't be what the state that he's kind of describing of like, well, we just blow the lid off, everybody do what you want, it's all by revolution. We would see a pretty what we would call conservative society in Athens, even though it was a total democracy, a pure democracy, just by vote. But even then, it was still strictly controlled of who was doing the voting, and even then, and when he gets into the democratic character, obviously, so the corresponding character to this state would be one who is compulsive, spontaneous, capricious, and just fulfilling their immediate desires. So not even like the pursuit of money. There's no common end. It's just whatever they want at the time, right? So they may be pursuing the virtuous goods in one second, and then pursuing money in another, and then being prowess in battle. So he oscillates between all these different desires, and there's no one ruler. Athens, that was definitely not the case whatsoever. They couldn't have built the empire that they built if that was the case. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it just doesn't completely wash together. However, it does highlight and illustrate his point, I guess. But even then you run into problems, because when we're talking about, a state with complete license, it goes back to what I was saying before. You could technically have a just person within a democratic society. And also, we have never really seen a democratic society of what he's talking about, even in the United States and just modern Western civilization today, where we have in the greatest amounts of liberties in all of human history, I would say. We still don't see. You don't really see something of the nature that what he's discussing right now. I mean, we're probably closer to that now than he was in Athens, but still, it doesn't. The conception doesn't necessarily line up completely.
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. So we then pretty quickly run into the final category, the final type, and he calls it tyranny. And this is when it seems like some other type of revolution takes place. A champion of the people takes over, and circumstances I don't really remember exactly what leads to it, but I think he kind of makes it a point. It's once you hit this exhaustion of liberty, just like there was an exhaustion period of greed.
Extreme liberty leads to extreme tyranny, essentially extreme autocracy. Like, it's just, that's what he says is the natural way of things, in which we finally, like you said, they're exhausted. Like, we need to put order in this society, and so we elevate the best among us to then lead. Mm-hmm. A man of the people, a hero,
right?
And because basically what he says is that, like, there are like victim groups that are created in which, like, people are victimized by others, and people are trampling on each other's freedoms, and then so to put an end to that chaos, a tyrant comes into power.
Right. And I think we're familiar enough with the idea of a tyrant and what that looks like. We've all heard the stories of Julius Caesar and the various kings and stuff, but essentially it's a very politically bloody, controlling era.
Yes.
Of course, he even mentions having like a secret police force.
Right, he does.
I'm like, oh wow,
absolutely.
yeah, that is a common theme of tyrants, and there's a reason for that, because they need to secure their power, and squash the would be rebels. And so this tyrannical king is the complete opposite of our philosopher king. And that's why I think he ends here, right? It's because now we can really clearly see, okay, so I've established my perfect society with my perfect rulers, and here's the most imperfect we can get.
Right. The tyrant has absolutely no. So a tyrannical society for him is not a state. Is not a state under. It is a state under a tyrant, but he's describing a state being tyrannized, right? So it has more to do with the fact that it's not really like ruled by a tyrant, because the Greek conception of tyrant was just a man who had all the power, one single man.
So
right?
it was neutral. It wasn't.
Right. It didn't.
Okay.
Like now we have a current conception of tyranny as being one that is what he's describing as bloodthirsty or oppressive. However, then the word was a neutral term, politically speaking. So he's more describing a tyrannized state rather than one of a state being ruled by a tyrant. And so, however, you're right, is the complete devolution, because the tyrant has absolutely no conception of the common welfare, the common good. He is essentially what he's describing as self-destructive. He's just pursuing his own personal ends of maintaining power, and that is it. It's blindly pursuing these own ends. And what he calls those own ends is lust. That's how he defines it. He's fighting to repress any gifted people, like you're saying, that could rebel against him. And he describes him as a sick man, like he's mad and he's fighting even though he is sick. And it's just and he's driven by this passion of lust of pursuing whatever his own personal end would be, and he's willing to just destroy all in his path, and which is ending up to be self-destructive for himself. However, this is where the criticism comes in to this, because that doesn't really make any sense either. So I can see your face there. Like, we're
Yes, please explain.
So here's the thing: is that he's describing like a Caligula. You know what I mean? However, the thing is that a tyrant is not able to keep power and maintain power if he's just a sick and self-destructive person. I mean, we can say that he's not pursuing the common good, and we can say that he's just pursuing his own ends in accordance with his lusts. That's all well and good. But then he takes it a step farther by saying that, he's mad and he's just consumed by his passions and he's destroying all in his path. And I'm like, no, a tyrant who's gained power is somebody who's savvy politically. Somebody who's able to maintain that he has a degree of intelligence to recognize who he needs to keep around him and who he doesn't. They're bloody, yes, but I mean, when you look at like the Stalins and the Maos, these guys were intelligent, they were ruthless, and they led boring lives. Personally, they were boring. Like, what was Stalin before he became premier? He was the secretary of the Communist Party. And that's what allowed him to gain all of his power. He was a boring, bureaucratic man who wore gray and browns all the time. But it was that quiet, reserved, cold, calculating willingness to do what was necessary to maintain. That the wild Caligula is not going to last too long, especially if we're describing him as a sick man. He will lose that battle. Mm-hmm. So that's when you're kind of like, well, does that really match up? No, not on a practical sense. But then even then, like on a philosophical sense, going back to Thrasymachus' question, this is my big critique of the tyranny section, is that we've been told that we are going to be shown how justice is better than injustice. Like, it just pays more, right? It doesn't pay to be unjust. It pays to be just. The tyrant he's describing, it pays to be unjust because he won. You know what I mean? He's now being able to pursue his own pleasures. Mm-hmm. It's not, he's able to, he's basically gets what he wants. And that's Thrasymachus' point. If you go all the way back to book 1, Thrasymachus is like, it's the strong over the weak, man. Like, that's all it's about. And you know what? It pays to be unjust. It pays because you're going to be able to get what you want. You're going to be able to pursue your own ends. And you're going to be able to hold power if you're unjust, if you're wily, you're savvy, and you're crude, and you're cunning. Well, guess what? Plato just says, yeah, you can actually. And so,
but to be fair, he makes the point that yes, you will be able to fulfill those pleasures that you're seeking, but will they leave you with a deeper, truer happiness?
Right. That's what gets into the next section actually. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing, is that, so when we go into the next section, when we start to talk about pleasures, Plato was not asked to prove to us. Once again, going back to book 1 and trying to tie this all together, he was not asked to prove that justice was pleasurable, but rather it just led to a happy, fulfilling life. But now he's talking about it in terms of pleasure, so it becomes consequentialist. He's saying that you need, like, being just so like, at least in the original, like the middle books, he was saying being just is something good to be pursued on its own, right? Mm-hmm. It's like health, like it's necessary for you. And so, however, now it's, oh no, be just because it pays to be just. There's a consequence to it. It leads to pleasure.
Yeah.
And it doesn't rub up well together, because then what happens is that when you enter into that, what he just established in the tyranny is that no, it just pays to be unjust. And then, but what you're saying is that your point is that, however, it's not the right kind of pleasure. Like it's disordered. Right. There are higher pleasures. But then when we get into these other sections, and here's the thing, is that I could easily respond by saying, well, hold up, Austin, who are you to say, isn't pleasure a thing that is subjective? Like you like hot chocolate, or like, let's just take beer. Like, once again, going back to a beer example. Yeah. So I like beer. You don't like beer. I think beer is pleasurable. I enjoy drinking nice beer. Okay. And I find pleasure in that. And then are you to say that, like, well, actually, Aaron, philosophy is a higher pleasure than beer? And I'm like, okay, great. But that doesn't make beer less pleasurable for me.
Yeah.
And you see what I mean? Like,
So I guess there is no escaping at a certain point. It is consequentialist. That's what you've been calling it, meaning like, well, if you put the desire for money above the desire for reason, you will inevitably ruin your life and find dissatisfaction. So it has. I can't find a way to solve this without it eventually becoming, well, don't do this otherwise, or do this because.
Well, you can say, according to the earlier books, you can say, well, the pursuit of money is disordered, right? You can say, well, that is not good, right? With the capital G, and going back to those forms, right? It's not in accordance with the nature of things. And I'm giving that a very broad stroke because I'm not going to go into all the terms. But here's the thing: is that but we're talking about pleasure specifically. So you can't say, well, my pursuit of money is less pleasurable. I'm like, no, I find pleasure in it. You can say it's not a good, it's not the good to be pursuing, but you can't say it's less pleasurable. You see what I'm saying? There's a distinction there.
So can you say, and we're a little outside the book at this point, I guess, because now it's just
we're still now in this next section. We'll get into Plato's response to all this. But
can you say that long term, what is good is pleasurable, and what is bad is only immediately pleasurable?
That's kind of what he's trying to say, right? Is that well, justice produces happiness, and the happiness produces pleasure, but then you end up kind of in the same thing where it's like, well, even then you're still establishing a consequentialist ethic.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, okay, well, it pays in the short term, or well, then again, it wouldn't be wholly good because it should pay in the short term and the long term, I could argue. But then the second thing would be like, it's still consequentialist. It still doesn't fit with the middle books because you're still saying, okay, but in the long term, finally, I'll be happy. It's like, okay, so still.
So it's not justice.
I pursue justice now because it's a long term investment for me.
So do you think he was wrong to establish, which one do you think is right? Consequentialism or justice for the sake of justice?
I'm not here to establish my personal opinions.
Well, because I'm curious, like, obviously his 2 points are incompatible, but it's like, which one is stronger to begin with?
Oh, virtue ethics, most definitely. Because you don't want to, because consequentialist ethics, you eventually end up in like utilitarianism and things of that nature, right? So, and that's obviously not in terms of the body of his work what Plato is going for. It's just this is like what I'm essentially saying is that these are weak arguments. These are inconsistent, weak philosophical arguments that he's presenting, at least in the city-soul parallel dichotomies that he's establishing. Because what you see is that you have not only do you have societies that don't really practically make any sort of sense, and also he's not accounting for the fact that people are individual characters even in those societies, right? So it's like it's kind of silly to say like there's a direct one-to-one comparison. But now you're kind of getting into, okay, well, he's answering a question. He's basically falling into like Thrasymachus's argument by saying like, oh, well, happiness leads to greater amounts of pleasure. And it's like, no, that's not what you were saying before. The whole point was to like basically reorder the definition, right? And then now we're just going back to the original definition of what we're considering happiness or pleasure. Like happiness was pleasure, right? But we wanted to get away from that happiness was not pleasure. Right, it wasn't
maybe
an
he
equal.
Forgot. Maybe he took like a long vacation between these two.
Probably. I mean, there may be some truth to that. I'm not sure. I would have to do some more research on that end. But it's there's a lot more to be said on this, and I think that I'm only establishing the weaknesses because I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna destroy my arguments. So
Good.
Don't worry
Excellent.
about that. Yeah.
So then we turn into this other section where I thought we were at the end of the chapter, and I was like, oh, good, I did my reading for the month. And then no, there were like 30 more pages. But this was some really good stuff. This is where he starts to work in the definition again and bring us back to the initial argument. We've already touched on it a little bit, but like I'm reading here in the editor's notes here, that he's now going to bring back in that threefold classification of the soul, and kind of pin those against each other. So can you give us the summary of this kind of conclusion section, or do you want to break it into parts? Or
yeah, so the first thing I would say is that he's saying that the philosopher is the one who's most capable of understanding pleasure, because he possesses these three key things, which are he has experience of all the pleasures, he has the practical wisdom, and he has the actual philosophical wisdom. And he's able to kind of sit back and discern exactly what is pleasurable and what is not pleasurable. So he's kind of establishing that like there is an objective pleasure that exists, which, like we're kind of discussing before, doesn't really vibe. But then it eventually gets into perhaps that there are higher pleasures than others, and we'll get into that. But so essentially what he's saying is that the philosopher has experiences, right? So as a person, he's able to experience, the love of money or the pursuit of food or these other bodily pleasures. But then because of his practical experience, because we're imagining the philosopher king being an older gentleman, right? But then has the pursuit of philosophy and has experienced all of life, he's able to sit back and say, you know what, these pleasures, they're not really pleasures. The things that you're pursuing are not really good for you. However, these other things are what's right. And that actually kind of makes sense, right? Because we would say, okay, well, I do look for mentors in my life. I do look for advisors and counselors to come in and who should be older than me, who have lived life and are much more well-read and much more intelligent than me, to come in and say, okay, well, I think that your love of electronic dance music is probably not the best thing for you, and
I agree.
And you should probably listen to classical music, and here are some vinyls for you. Just here you go, and try to just get into it, and I think that would be more pleasurable for you. And I think there's some truth to that. That there are pleasures that are higher. When Dr. Plaza was teaching us John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism, he talked about how Mill would establish different pleasures and Mill goes farther than Plato, but the argument that he used, the example, he said, well, do you think that Citizen Kane is greater than The Simpsons? And it's like, well, yeah, I think Citizen Kane is better than The Simpsons. Well, this is the problem we're having today, right, in America, where
yes.
So, but anyway, and so we say yes, and so he's like, that's what Mill's talking about. And Plato's kind of in the same vein, where it's like, okay, well, obviously, Beethoven is better than I don't know who.
Ed Sheeran.
I hate Ed Sheeran.
There
so
you
yeah,
go.
We can. Yeah, Beethoven's better
perfect.
than Ed Sheeran. And then also he says that our pleasures and pains are also. But then this is where he gets kind of weird, because if you look in your section, he starts to talk about how our pleasures and pains are just matters of degree, and where we understand them in short and long term, where it's like in the short term I may say, oh, I don't want to go to the dentist, like that's going to be a pain, but then in the long term I see that as a great pleasure, because I'm like, oh, well, my teeth are clean and I'm making sure that I don't have any cavities and I have to go back and get fillings or my teeth are going to fall out or something like that. You know what I mean? So then he says that they're in direct comparison, that what we may feel currently, and then we evaluate them based on the short term and the long term. And so that means that like how we view pleasure and pain are just mental states, like they just change over time, and then rest would be considered to be in between pleasure and pain. And then once again it goes back into that idea of things being in flux. Plato hates that, like right? So he's like, oh, if a thing is in flux, where something can be viewed as both a pleasure and a pain, that means it is neither. Like a thing can't be both at one time. So he's saying that, well, then that means that your conceptions of, and this is where it gets really weird, he says your conceptions of pleasures and pains are not really like truly pleasures or pains. They're not really like, it's just that's just a feeling that you have about something. It doesn't really make sense. And then following that logic, then he says that since they're not really real, right? He says that what we consume then is just a means of filling the body. So, like for example, eating food, like, oh, I want to eat food in the short term. That's gonna satisfy me, right? That's gonna be pleasurable. And then you eat it, and then he's like, okay, well, that's fine. But then if you ate too much of it, you may have gotten a stomach ache or whatever. And so, so there's a dichotomy of pleasure and pain that exists there. Or, that's a pretty bad example, but we'll just run with it. I get it. Yeah. And so he's saying that, however, because it's not really a pleasure or a pain, it's like a state of flux that exists in your mind where you're just kind of considering these things. That means it's just consuming it's just something that's satisfying your bodily needs. But the body for Plato is not really the source of true pleasure or goodness or happiness, because he's going to say that knowledge and reason, the pursuit of philosophy, are something that's like, fulfilling reason, fulfilling the pleasures of the mind, fulfilling the pleasures of reason. Because remember, he says
right,
that
we're just moving up the
right,
chain
exactly,
from the
exactly.
stomach to
The mind, the heart, and the stomach all have their different pleasures, and he says that there are those higher pleasures. Going back to that original point, there are higher pleasures, and then there are lower pleasures, right? But now he's going to say that those lower pleasures are not actually even real. He's going to say that they're in a state of flux. The higher pleasures are actually more real.
Going back to forms, like saying...
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you. Because now I'm going to say, okay, so going back to the forms, we said, well, the forms are predicated, right? We would say, okay, what is F? Like, what is F means that it isn't truly F. Mm-hmm. Right. So a tree, like the form of tree would be something that is and truly is tree, like in the essence of what a tree is, unpredicated, right? So it does not come from anything else. It is just tree, the essence of. I know, like we're going back to...
Well, I have a metaphor that I thought of just now, because I've been working with these types of files all week, but on a computer system for video editing, I don't want my students editing the original copy of the footage. So we create in editing what are called proxies. They're smaller, bite-sized files that I can distribute to multiple computers that my students can kind of tamper with. And if they screw it up royally, they have not altered the original files. So when Plato's kind of talking about the forms, it's almost as if every tree on Earth is pulling from the original, but they're just proxies.
Yeah.
They're not the core heart of it. I thought of that. I was like, oh, that helps me understand the forms a little better.
Right.
Anyway, sorry.
But then I want to get away from the tree discussion, like, and more into like, what is, like I use the example, what is large, right? So large is what is, and truly large, unpredicated, that is what it is. It is the essence of what is large. It's not a state of conception of what is large in comparison to other things that are big or small, because that's a state of flux. It's the same thing with our pleasures, right? It's the same. It's literally a one-to-one argument, like you just said. So then with that being said, Plato is going to say that however, these pleasures, these higher pleasures, are not in a state of flux. They are true. The pursuit of philosophy and wisdom. However, that doesn't make any sense, because we can't say, I know, because we can't say that knowledge that is knowledge is more truly knowledge. You can't, like, you see what?
Yeah, hold on. Say
knowledge,
it one more time.
Yeah, that the pursuit of knowledge knowledge that is knowledge is more truly knowledge. Like, essentially what he is saying is that knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge and like the gaining of knowledge, is more true, and so therefore for it to be more true has more being.
Yeah.
And it's like, how does that make sense? How does something like reason or knowledge or philosophy have more being? Like, it is just is more, as a pleasure, is more true, has more being, is more than, but because that doesn't fit the conception of what we were establishing in the forms, because the forms before were essences, right? They were the essences of things, unpredicated, that allowed things to be informed within them. So like a conception such as justice, and then everything descending from capital T, truth, what is like truly, what truly is in and of itself, right? But then when we're talking about these things, he's saying essentially that things that are immortal and do not change are now what we should consider to be forms, because like the idea of like knowledge immutable is now possesses more being and is more true than the pleasures that you experience, and so therefore it is true. It's not in a state of flux, and it's like, what? Because we acknowledge that there are different forms of knowledge. There are varying kinds. Like, there are skills, there's practical wisdom,
right,
and then there's the philosophical, theoretical wisdom that we were talking about in terms of what was it called? Whatever. So the Greek term for that, and so which was like techne and
episteme.
Episteme.
I got
it. It's like, well, that doesn't really make any sense, because now we're no longer talking about the essences of things unpredicated like originally, but now we're like, so anything that is changeless and is immortal.
He definitely took a vacation, but
and it's like, does that really make any sense? No, it doesn't really. Again, it doesn't fit
with what he was saying.
What he was saying before.
Okay.
Do you have any questions?
Well,
before?
it's such a fine line. I think I'm understanding it.
Yeah, I'm
he has
I'm going
changed
through it
his
quick.
definition of form from unpredicated being to something that is just changeless.
Right.
Okay, so
And I mean, it's
fine,
one thing,
but
but here's the thing. It's one thing to say that like reason, because originally he would say that reason cares for the whole of the body, right? That fits with the middle sections, right? Because he's saying that reason is able to look and discern like things in their right order and determine what needs to be consumed and what doesn't, what ends to be pursued and what ends to not be pursued. And so you feed reason that way. So it's not that it's bad that you eat food, right? Because you need it. He's saying that you understand to not eat food in excess, and that you understand that you are going to eat, you are going to consume.
Sense.
Right. And then you are now going to go and have your reading time or your study or your contemplative time, and that you would make sure that things are balanced and well ordered in harmony. But now we're saying he's like, what you would denote originally as pleasures are not actually pleasures, because once again he's still trying to exist within that dichotomy of like there has to be a one-to-one comparison between the city and the soul. There has to be a one comparison between the pleasures and the forms, and it's like it's not a puzzle piece. It doesn't really fit.
Yeah, so we're feeling that tension. I can see that. Yeah.
I'm gonna try to read a section from Julia Annis.
Take it away.
So the reading from Julianus, I would say, is she says that the arguments about pleasure are not the mistake they are often said to be. Plato is not making an obvious mistake when he claims that the pleasantness as well as the goodness of the just person's life is objectively superior, though philosophical training and insight may be needed to see this. So, like as we're saying that there's nothing wrong to say that there are things that are more pleasant, Even though, again, I fundamentally disagree with Plato about even entering into the discussion about what is pleasant to begin with.
Sure.
If we disagree, it is up to us to argue and not just assert. That pleasantness can never be an objective matter. The arguments go wrong, rather, in their lack of caution. Claims about pleasantness which have some plausibility when applied to a whole life are incautiously extended to all cases of pleasure. Further, the unresolved tension between the practical and contemplative conceptions of the philosopher makes his role in these arguments questionable. What should be a claim about the worth of good practical reasoning is often mixed up with the claim about the value of eternal objects of knowledge. Plato recognized later that these arguments were too hasty and that he had not considered the nature of pleasure carefully enough. So he actually does go back in a later work and
Timaeus.
Is it in the Timaeus? Yeah, I think so.
It's kind of like the sequel-ish.
Yeah, it is. I think it is in the Timaeus where he's like, I didn't like that too much. So maybe he did take a vacation, but it just doesn't. It doesn't jibe, right? It doesn't fit well. But however, I will come in and defend Plato in just a second.
Well, we must as we're coming up on the end here. I think we have to talk about this final conclusion.
Yes, here we go.
And I think. At least here, I was breezing by these pages like, yes, because I really liked what he was saying, and it was kind of synthesizing a lot of what he had been getting at before.
Yeah, did you have a particular quote?
I mean, I really liked it. It's towards the end, page 333 in the Penguin. Just in the Penguin. But he says, can we possibly argue that it pays a man, again, back to that original language of the argument, that it pays a man to be unjust or self-indulgent or do anything base that will bring him more money and power but make him a worse man? We can't. And how can it pay him to escape, this was the crazy one, how can it pay him to escape the punishment of wrongdoing by not being found out? If he escapes, doesn't he merely become worse? And if he's caught and punished, isn't the beast in him calmed and tamed, and his humaner part set free? And I was like, oh, that's the part you heard me like do some weird groan on the couch before. Because in my life, like everyone's wired a little differently. I hate getting in trouble. My brother seems to love it. He just relishes in getting in trouble. Like he's always out to just destroy things. Or he was when we were growing up. We're different now. But for me, I've always been afraid of getting in trouble. I don't know why. It's just your natures. But that put it in such an interesting, put a really cool spin on it. Like getting caught is an opportunity for your humaner side to be set free and for that base, wilder animal side of you to be nerfed. And isn't that a great thing? And I was like, oh, I like that. I like that a lot. I mean, like, who in their right mind in 21st century America would say, well, it's so much better to get caught for a crime you committed? Like, I feel like nobody would say that. Even like some sort of religious, priest, pastor, I feel like would say, yeah, I don't know, that'd be tough. Like, most people don't want to be caught, and being caught, you have to go to prison. And we think of consequences so quickly, and not about the opportunity to become a better person. And that's not even talking about the correction. Like, our prisons maybe don't do the best job of correcting your mistakes and helping you to become that better person, but just the act of being caught corrects you. Yeah, it's so interesting. Anyway, I liked that, but I felt like that was a good small nugget that pretty much amplified the argument. But do you want to now build back out?
No, exactly what you said. I'm just going to go right into that. Absolutely. So I think it's fair to be dissatisfied with the arguments of book 8 and 9. Like, absolutely, I'm totally dissatisfied with it. I think they're almost, I would almost even claim that they're nearly philosophically inept. But I don't want to dismiss them, because here's the thing: is that Plato has completely redefined the very conception of what is justice, right? And as it leads to happiness, and he defines that as psychic harmony. Right. So wouldn't it also be true then that the very idea of what we would consider happiness is also going to be fundamentally changed? Yeah. So what he's essentially saying is that, because before we used to think that you can just achieve happiness regardless of the moral source, right? We can just this is what's going to lead to happiness. This is what you just need to pursue, these ends, and you will be happy as a consequence, or whatever that means. Plato is saying is that you have to fundamentally, I love this, you have to fundamentally change who you are as a person. Like, your moral source has to be completely reevaluated and changed. How you conceive of the world, how you understand justice and truth and beauty and life, all have to be fundamentally reevaluated, changed into this idea of psychic harmony. And then therefore, the happiness and the pleasure that you experience as a result of that happiness will also be fundamentally changed. And that's kind of the weakness. The strength of his argument is also the weakness. It's a weird double-edged sword, because he's engaging in these terms such as pleasure and happiness, and we see that as exposing a weakness in terms of Thrasymachus' argument, because he's using it in our terminology. However, fundamentally, what Plato is saying is that I've flipped the script. I changed exactly how this is supposed to look. Yeah. And so therefore your understanding of happiness is independent now.
So his idea of happiness, it almost sounds stoic if you take away the emotionless side of it and just look at your happiness is not determined by an end, being like a physical end, no matter what your life circumstances.
Yes.
If you can keep your soul ordered in this way that we've described and pursue these things in the order that they're meant to be pursued, you can be happy no matter what the life circumstance.
Right. He doesn't go. Yeah. It's up to Aristotle to take it to that end. He doesn't really. Yeah. Okay. The more practical side of things, but basically what he's saying is that he's like. We've changed our views of what is essential to justice, which is that of psychic harmony, and everything else that is bound up in what is creating psychic harmony. And however, the good consequences that come out, see, and that's the thing. It's just a natural flow, right? The good consequences that come out of psychic harmony are good, and are good consequences because of the thing that it is, because of what psychic harmony is, because of what justice is. Mm-hmm. Like, it's natural. It is not an action that you then take and then it produces happiness. It is a state of being that you hold within yourself, and then the consequences will just flow forth from that. Yeah. But you as an unjust person, or somebody who is middling in between, will not be able to understand the good consequences that come out of being a just human being. You only get to experience them and understand them if you are just. Yeah. It is fundamentally different, like fundamentally. And that's why you start to see, like, the arguments in book 8 and 9 are actually the same arguments in the original books. They seem to be distinct. I know, I'm sorry. They seem to be distinct, but what he's essentially saying is that, look, like, I have all these city-soul parallels that I've established, all these bad societies and their corresponding character. Yes, there are weaknesses in the argument, And yes, I've been talking about how, there are, different kinds of pleasure, and some pleasures are more true than others. But the whole reason of that whole breakdown is to demonstrate that your very understanding of what would constitute, goodness is going to be fundamentally morphed based on now the new moral stance that you have taken. And so all these other things will not appear to be pleasurable anymore. Everything has been changed. And then so I'm once again going to return to a quote to summarize here. We find the first part of the argument more convincing than the second, talking about book 4 through 6 or whatever. The difference between act and agent-centered theories of ethics, so here we are, is a deep one whose importance is recognized even if we do not follow Plato in his priorities. But we are inclined to dismiss book 8 and 9. There are good reasons for being dissatisfied with the arguments. They are hasty and casual about pleasure and how it is related to happiness, and Plato is not nearly so concerned to show that his conclusions here do not outrage common sense, as he is in the case of justice. But paradoxically, as I pointed out, in spite of the weakness of the arguments, they are underestimated. They express a deep point which modern theories of ethics find hard to express. The point that the happiness and pleasure that can be got from a life of certain moral type is in important ways intrinsic to that life. Utilitarians prefer to think of pleasure as something that can be got indifferently from any moral source. Going back to those choices, act-centered. And so as something to be maximized and distributed to people, agent-centered, regardless of what they are like. Plato's ideas here about pleasure, though not particularly well put, are more profound than anything to be found in any utilitarian theory.
I take it that writer doesn't like utilitarianism.
Who does?
John Stuart Mill, maybe.
Is it act-centered or agent-centered? I don't know. I have to think about it.
That's super... Well, this has been a bit of a roller coaster. My gosh. Yeah, Plato's an idiot. No, I love him. Oh my gosh.
Well, I wanted to give, I think we've been too much on being too kind to him a little bit. We're like, oh, he's great. And then I wanted to kind of like punch up a little bit, punch above my weight class for a second.
No, totally fair.
These are weak arguments. But, however, I mean, fundamentally different. Like, it is hard to, philosophically speaking, conceive of how his definitions are entirely different, and we have to reorient our thinking when you approach him. So he's definitely crazy.
Absolutely. And he takes vacations, apparently. So that's what we learned this week.
We'll have to do the Timaeus then at some point.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Maybe in like 2 years. Well, this has been fun. Next episode is the one on art. So that'll be an interesting...
we could probably why don't we just do the whole thing?
Do the rest?
Yeah, we'll just...
Okay.
Next episode will be the last one.
Well, we have one more episode of Plato's Republic, so certainly you'll want to stay tuned. If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast on whatever medium you're listening to us on. Make sure you leave us some good feedback. That always helps us, and that would certainly encourage us to keep going with this. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations, feel free to email us at the academypodcast@outlook.com. We'd love to read them. I would like to take your feedback and your considerations and your recommendations. And I think that's it.
Yeah, guys, we surpassed. We hit 2,000 downloads on the podcast, so that's huge for us. We didn't think we were going to get that much attention. We love all of you, and we're so thankful for your listening and just all your support. And so we're going to be finishing up here on Plato's Republic and moving on to I wouldn't say bigger and better things, but I would just say other things.
Cool. Yeah. All right, take care, guys.
Take care.